Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. Today we've got a very cool video for you. This is one of those things that I've been on probably half the museum ships in the world and haven't ever seen anything like this before. It is the missile launchers on the guided missile cruiser USS Little Rock in Buffalo, New York. We're at the Buffalo Naval Park today on board USS Little Rock. They also have the submarine Croker and the destroyer the Sullivans and a number of other ships. But by far their largest is the USS Little Rock, a World War II era light cruiser that was retrofitted post-war with missiles. Familiar story, right? Similar thing happens to New Jersey. The difference is New Jersey isn't retrofitted with missiles until the 1980s. Little Rock is retrofitted in the 1950s with some significantly earlier generation missiles. Behind me, you can see the Talos missile, one of a trifecta of surface-to-air missiles that the US Navy started developing during World War II as we saw incoming missile threats from the Axis powers, such as the German Fritz X glided missile, the V1 and V2s, and even the Japanese kamikazes are essentially piloted missiles. So these sorts of threats, the Navy thought they could challenge with another series of missiles. So they came up with three that were workable, basically a small, medium, and large version, which could do short, medium, and long range to engage enemy ships. And Talos is the long-range version. In its final form, this could engage targets up to 100 miles away, and it has, again, in its final form, not necessarily the version first deployed in the early 50s, but in its final form, it could engage land, sea, or air targets. And it, much like our Tomahawks, carried both conventional and nuclear warheads. So, here on the deck, you can see the twin-armed launcher for the Talos missiles, and above and behind that, you can see the directors that would have aimed them. Let's go inside and see the loading area. So we're at the extreme aft end of the superstructure here, just forward of the missile launcher itself out on the main deck, and the first feature that we run into related to missile handling is the nuclear warhead stowage, which would have been down below. So, much like the battleship stores its most dangerous and explosive stuff low down in the ship, so too on Little Rock. Just forward of that is the missile test area. Come on in here and check this out. So the magazine is forward of us a little bit. We'll go in there next. However, these are early generation missiles. Early generation missiles were pretty finicky, as you can imagine. Even later blocks of the Talos weren't perfect, and even if they were, because of some of the teething issues with early generations, they weren't entirely trusted. So the ship has a testing area so that you could rotate through your missiles that are stacked in the magazine. The magazine's real cool. I can't wait to show you guys this in the next clip. But essentially you can play a shell game with the missiles in there using all of these complex hydraulic crane gantries to move them around so that you can access all of your missiles and rotate them through testing on a periodic basis. So this area at the extreme aft end of the superstructure doesn't go towards loading or anything else. You bring it in and you got all your testing equipment, you got hookups overhead, and you got all your pressure gauges and whatnot, and you can make sure that it's functioning properly, perform any maintenance you need to, and then shuffle it into your deck up in the magazine. So now we are in the magazine. On Little Rock and these early missile-carrying ships, the missiles are stowed horizontally, as opposed to on a modern ship like an Arleigh Burke destroyer, a Ticonderoga-class cruiser, where you've got vertical launch tubes. It's a Sherwood forest inside the ship with all these launch tubes nested among each other. Early days of missiles, they're stored horizontally like this, and then they can just be taken right out to the missile launcher itself. They're put on the launcher horizontally. Now this, of course, takes time. You've got to reload the missiles. You've got to assemble the missiles. We'll talk about assembly in a minute. And then you've got to transport them over there. So having missiles stored in canisters and vertical launch tubes is the much quicker version. That's what ships nowadays have. The Iowa class has something in the middle. So our Harpoon anti-ship missiles are fixed. Our Tomahawk cruise missiles, which, you know, the Tomahawk is still in use and uses vertical launch tubes, the Iowas were never fitted with that. So they've got those armored box launchers that they have to take the time to elevate before they can fire, but otherwise the missiles are in individual tubes. You don't have to play a shell game with them to do all your testing. You can do the testing of them right there in their canister. So here's your magazine, and check out all this overhead gantry equipment to move these missiles around. Look at the size of this missile. So missiles stored in spaces like these in multiple parts. And then you have to assemble the body and the booster that actually gets it off into the air. And then from here, you've got to take it to another location and assemble all the wings and fins so it can actually maneuver in flight. Obviously, missiles carry an explosive warhead. They also carry a tremendous amount of fuel to propel them, and they're stored up here on the main deck. They're not down below in any sort of magazine like the projectiles for the guns. So they are as protected as can be here in the superstructure of the ship. But also, if you get a fire in one space or the other, you've got doors like this one that can shut and separate out your area. And I've seen so far 3 or 4 different sections here in the magazines that can be locked down to try and localize any damage or accident type stuff. You'll also notice that in these spaces, much like the hazardous spaces on an Iowa-class battleship, they have a CO2 suppression system and other firefighting equipment all over the place. No surprise there. It's what we've come to expect, even though the rest of the space looks nothing at all like anything we have any context for. All right, so the space we just came out of, we've now moved forward slightly. That, again, is where the boosters and the missiles themselves are assembled, and then they go on from there to the next space we'll go to, which is final assembly with the tails and fins. This space is where everything is stored normally. You've got an overhead loading hatch right there to feed more missiles in. You've got this nice big yellow overhead gantry crane that can slide back and forth and up and down to rotate through your missiles. And of course, you've got the track system here that we've been following somewhat to then move the missiles to the next stage. So it's really interesting how much movement and how analog these missiles are. It's very, very different from anything in the modern ships. It takes up a lot of space and a lot of weight, and so you can see why, as these become more and more developed, they move on to these later styles of vertical launch tubes. That was actually a Soviet Union invention that the US looked at and went, oh, that's actually pretty smart, let's do that. So, looking out behind me, you can see that there are 4 of those missile holding carts already set up. You could be assembling the bodies and the boosters down there at a pretty good pace and have several stacked up and ready to go here, so that as a missile is fired, the next one can be brought in here for the final assembly. Final assembly involves installing the wings and fins. A Talos missile has 12 of these for controlling it in flight. And so there are several workstations around here already pre-positioned with your wings and fins. It usually take about 2 or 3 minutes to pull these out and slot them in, get them all set up. And then you've got foot pedals here where you can kick to send the signal up to say that it is complete. And then finally, your missile has been assembled with all the major compartments, 12 wings and fins, a booster, and the actual missile itself. And if it's nuclear, the warhead as an entirely separate compartment. And you come back here to these butterfly doors. When the missile is sitting here, the wings go on in an X pattern, not a cross pattern, an X pattern. So that allows it to go through the butterfly-shaped doors here. It gets pushed right out the door and onto the arm of the launcher. At that point, takes about 20 seconds. The launcher can rotate at the target, basically following wherever the director's telling it to go. Fire the missile. The booster gets it off, and then the booster drops off, and the missile itself takes over and launches. Another change between ships during this era, immediately post-World War II, and modern ships, this one you are very much turning the launcher at the target you're pointing at, even though the target may be up to 100 miles away. On a modern ship, the vertical launch tube, you just shoot the missile off, and it goes up into the air a certain level, and then it decides what direction it's been told to go and goes that way. So you don't have to take the extra time to point something around. So you can see how time consumptive these early missiles are, and how similar it is to the magazines of gun-fed ships prior to that, where you've got your projectile and you've got your propellant, and you've got to put the nose fuse on, and then you've got to move them through various steps of the barbette before they're ready to fire. It's very similar with these early missiles. And then they start to realize, hey, this is something completely different from guns. We can do something different. And over the course of 30 or 40 years, they developed that system. As a kid, up until last night, I always thought it was weird that these ships sacrificed so much of their superstructure, so much of their former magazine spaces for these missiles. The ship lost her aft 2 6-inch gun mounts, her aft 5-inch gun mounts, and they built this big deck house in its place. I always thought of missiles like the modern ones I grew up with. By the time I was born, vertical launch tubes were already prevalent, and the last of the non-vertical launch ships are being taken out of service, and for the U.S. Navy at least. So it was really weird to me. Like, okay, they've pulled out the turret, they've got all those magazine spaces below it. Obviously the missiles are down there facing up, and they just have to come up to the launcher itself and they're ready to go, right? No. I was always confused about this huge deck house with all of these spaces, and finally coming on Little Rock and seeing it has helped explain. Like I've read Friedman's U.S. Cruisers, Illustrated Design History, and talks about all this, and it just didn't click with me until you actually see it in person, how much space it takes up to assemble the various stages and move them around. And the whole idea of testing them, having to play this shell game to pull different ones out to test. It's something like every 30 days you have to test the missile. This ship can carry over 40 missiles when she's fully loaded. So it's like every day you're testing a missile and a half to make sure that they're working again. So you're constantly rotating through your stack of missiles. And obviously you know how often the United States gets into wars during the time period that the ship is in service. How much did we need an expensive anti-air missile? Well, Talos was used on 3 separate occasions during the Vietnam War and destroyed up to 4 MiGs. There's some debate about 3 or 4. 3 missiles were fired. 1 missile might have gotten 2. That would have been cool. But we're not firing these off and replacing them frequently. So they're constantly rotating through to test them and then send them back home to get the next upgrade and getting new missiles on board in their place. So finally, I've got an explanation for why these ships had to be so heavily modified and had to take such a large conversion, and that included using so much space, a really high and long superstructure, more so than they had been built with. USS Little Rock is a real gem. There's no other museum ship like her out there. There's no other way to visualize these spaces. So I really recommend you guys come to Buffalo and check her out. What's your favorite missile? Let us know in the comment section down below. Do you think missiles are actually better than guns? Let us know down below. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, also from a number of other businesses and private individuals like yourselves. We really appreciate your support. There's a link in the description below if you'd like to donate to the Buffalo Naval Park. They could really use your support in restoring this one-of-a-kind vessel and the other ships here at the park. There's also links down below to their social media pages if you want to check out their YouTube channel, which has way more videos and goes into way more depth into these sorts of spaces. You can support Battleship New Jersey by liking, sharing, and subscribing so more people find out about us and our channel. Thanks for watching.